Such an approach is literally making ourselves out to be God instead by saying we will do it our way instead of God's way. It is saying we will give what we want to give, not what He desires from us. This way of thinking is nothing new. It is literally the way of Cain. In the account of Cain, Cain decided to do things his own way, what was right in his own mind, or he followed what was right in his own heart, if you will. 1 John chapter 3. We should not be like Cain, who was the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. You might be thinking, surely defending Christmas and Easter cannot be just like Cain. How is that the same at all? Well, let's find out. According to John, Cain murdered his own brother because Cain's ways were evil and his brothers were righteous. Before we begin discussing Cain, we need to mention something rather important that not all realize. When the Bible uses Lord in all capital letters, it is actually the translators replacing the Creator's name as a tetragrammaton in Hebrew, Yod-He, Vav-He. We often place that back into the Scriptures as He intended, and based on our best scholarly guess and many others, we pronounce that as Yahweh. Genesis chapter 4. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of Yahweh. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to Yahweh an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought his firstborn of his flock, and of their fat portions. And Yahweh had regard for Abel and his offering. But for Cain and his offering he had no regard. And Cain was very angry, and his face fell. Yahweh said to Cain, Why are you angry? And why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Cain most certainly knew the law of God, or the Torah in Hebrew, meaning instructions. It demanded at an appointed time, or moed in Hebrew, God instructed a certain sacrifice. Sometimes the law of God demands a grain offering, sometimes a sacrifice. In this instance, God required a sacrifice, like Abel offered. Cain decided to do and offer what he wanted to offer. Abel heard and obeyed the Father. Cain decided to do what he thought was right, or what he thought was best, to worship in his own way, to follow his own heart. Thus, the Cain attitude is to do things our own way, despite what Yahweh wants or desires. Jude chapter 11. Woe to them, for they walked in the way of Cain, and abandoned themselves for the sake of gain to Balaam's error, and perished in Korah's rebellion. It is easy to get caught up in the trap of thinking we can worship God in any way we choose. God's people have been known to make that mistake over and over again. The most classic example is the way of Cain mentality, and is in the event of the golden calf. Yeah, believe it or not, Christmas and Easter can be compared to the event of the golden calf. How many realize that the intent of the Israelites was not to worship a false god with the golden calf, but Yahweh our God? In the story of the golden calf, once again, God's people start doing things and worshiping God their own way. God does not appreciate His people worshiping Him in any way that they choose. There is a protocol that He has defined for us, a way to worship Him, and the ways not to worship Him. He is the one being worshipped, not us. We need to understand how we are to worship Him and not worship Him. We should not want to mess that up. But that is what God's people do all too often. And the story of the golden calf is no different. It's the most classic example of us trying to worship God in our own way, not His way. It all starts in Exodus 32. Here we find that Moses has gone up to the mountain, but after some time, the Israelites begin to panic, for they fear that Moses has died. Exodus chapter 32. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Moses was much more than simply a leader to them. Moses was their only mediator between God and man. Moses spoke to God on their behalf, and God spoke to the Israelites through Moses. Moses was the mediator between God and man. This head role is now reserved for Yeshua and Yeshua alone. and only Yeshua now functions as Moses. However, during the time of the Exodus, Moses was the mediator. Here is their perceived problem. They feared that they lost Moses. They believed that they needed to replace their mediator. They were afraid they're not going to be able to communicate with Yahweh any longer because their mediator, Moses, is missing, or perhaps even dead. Since they were in Egypt, they happened to learn a thing or two about the Egyptian tradition of interacting with gods. In their understanding, you require a physical medium to facilitate such divine interaction. They needed a mediator between them and God. We know that this was what they were thinking because they instructed to Aaron, "Make us gods who shall go before us." And then what do we see as their reason for saying this? "As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." So in their mind, Yahweh, through Moses, brought them out of Egypt. Yet Moses is now missing. And in their mind, that's a big problem. And big problems require urgent solutions. So the urgent solution was to make us gods. But how would gods replace Moses? And how would gods be a good thing in their mind? Have they already forgotten who brought them out of Egypt? And have they forgotten who just spoke to them down at the mountain before they became afraid and asked Moses to go up and get the commandments for them? In the English, this certainly sounds bad. However, the word here for gods in Hebrew is Elohim. Elohim is the Hebrew word also translated as the one true God, or it could also be translated as gods. So nearly any time you see the word God in your English translations, the Hebrew word is in fact Elohim, despite the fact that Elohim is plural. Elohim can refer to false gods or the one true God. The context determines the correct understanding. So, we need to figure out if the Israelites were attempting to make a physical image of God as a mediator to reach God, or were they trying to make gods as in false gods? The Israelites, as a solution to replace the perhaps dead Moses, to replace their mediator with God, decided that they need to make God, or really create that interface they believed they needed to have so they can talk with God, to replace Moses, who they feared was dead. So often we have been taught that the Israelites were making a false God, but in the English it says that they wanted to make gods, not God. Clearly, they only made one God, despite the fact that they used a plural form of El, which is Elohim. That suggests that they meant that they wanted to make the one true God, Elohim, not false gods. Otherwise, they would have made multiple gods, just like the English translation suggests. Now, that may not be enough to prove the point for you, but there is much more to consider. Most already know that the Israelites chose to make a calf. In fact, they seemingly entertained no debate or discussion about it. It simply seemed to be the understood form that Yahweh should take. But why did they choose a calf? Exodus 32, verses 2 through 4. So Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took all the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. If the Israelites were trying to make Yahweh in physical form, as a mediator to replace Moses, it was certainly no accident that the Israelites chose a calf. Why? Why did they choose a calf to represent Yahweh? In Scripture, God is often likened to an ox, even in the context of the Exodus. For example, Numbers chapter 24. God brings them out of Egypt. He has the strength like a wild ox. Why, though, and how would they have known this? They knew this because they spoke and wrote ancient pictograph Hebrew. Do you recall the English word translated as God in English Bibles? It's the Hebrew word Elohim. There are two Hebrew words commonly translated as God, El and Eloah. When reading the Bible, it is better to have an ancient Hebrew perception of God rather than our modern Western view. The word El was originally written with two pictographic letters, one being an ox head and the other a shepherd's staff. The ox represented strength, and the staff of the shepherd represented authority. First, the ancient Hebrews saw God as the strong one of authority. The shepherd's staff was also understood as a staff on the shoulders, a yoke. Secondly, the ancient Hebrews saw God as the ox in the yoke. When plowing a field, two oxen were placed in a yoke. One was older and more experienced, and the other younger and lesser experienced. The younger would learn from the older. The Hebrews saw God as the older experienced ox, and they as the younger who learns from him. The plural form of Eloah is Elohim, and is often translated as God. While English plurals only identify quantity, as in more than one, the Hebrew plural can identify quantity as well as quality. Something that is of great size or stature can be written in the plural form, and in this case, God, as great strength and authority, is frequently written in the plural form Elohim. The two letters in these Hebrew words are the ox head representing strength and the shepherd's staff representing authority. Combined, they mean the strong authority, as well as the ox with a staff. The yoke is understood as a staff on the shoulders. If you are interested, you can learn more at the Ancient Hebrew Research Center. So, the choosing of a calf to represent God was clearly intentional. There is a logical reason that they did not choose a rabbit or a fish or anything else. Elohim in the Hebrew gives us the word picture of the ox and authority. And guess what? They said they're going to make Elohim. Make us Elohim, who shall go before us. Remember, Elohim is the same Hebrew word that is translated as God in Scripture. And Elohim, as a word picture, fits their interest in making a calf perfectly. Thus, they were not interested in making gods, so to speak. They were interested in making God, or Yahweh. Not so much as they literally thought that they were making God, but they were continuing in the Egyptian tradition and practice of making an image of God so you can connect and speak to him. Which, of course, is what Moses was for, but they feared that he was dead. After the golden calf is presented, Israel says something very interesting. Exodus chapter 32, verse 4. And they received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. In the English, it seems that they're presenting the golden calf as gods. But that doesn't make any sense. It's singular. In reality, he is saying to Israel, here's your Elohim, or if you will, here's your God who brought you out of Egypt, meaning the one true God. Now, clearly, in most English translations, the usage of gods does not make any sense for multiple reasons. Israel already declared Yahweh to be their only God. Why would Israel suddenly believe that a different God took them out of Egypt? That would make no sense whatsoever. In addition, only one God took them out of Egypt, and the Israelites knew this. So why do English translators use the plural form gods, as in false gods, when that would make no sense? Aaron is only presenting one golden calf, not golden calves, meaning singular, not plural. Meaning this, and this is important to understand. The Israelites clearly never intended on making gods, but instead God, as evidenced by the one singular God they made in the form of a calf, which happens to be the exact same word picture that the pictograph of Elohim represents in Hebrew. And then they say that this golden calf brought them out of Egypt. Clearly they know this is not literally the case, as Yahweh brought them out of Egypt. So why do English translations say gods and not God? Because of the nature of the Hebrew word Elohim. Elohim can mean the plural form of false gods or the one true God. This would mean that the Israelites believed that they produced an image of Yahweh as the calf. They believed that they created an image of the one true God who took them out of Egypt. This should make much more sense because the ancient Hebrew pictograph of Elohim is an ox with an authority. So they are simply creating what they already understood about God. In an effort to relieve their concerns about losing Moses as their mediator, they in fact created an image of their understanding of Yahweh to worship and connect with him as their new mediator. They were so worried that they lost Moses, which was their mediator to connect with Yahweh, that they believed they had to replace Moses with an object to be the new mediator between Israel and God. So all of these things clearly tell us that they were intending to worship Yahweh through the calf. Still don't believe it despite all the evidence? Do you still believe that the Israelites were trying to worship false gods instead of worshiping Yahweh in their own way? There's still one more thing that solidifies this understanding, and this is huge. In the Hebrew, we are told that Aaron actually dedicates a feast to Yahweh. Exodus 32, verses 5 through 6. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to Yahweh." And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Aaron declares that the feast is for Yahweh, and then they offer gifts to him. Unfortunately, this is the way of Cain mentality to the extreme. You might be thinking, in my Bible, it says Lord, not Yahweh. But recall what we mentioned earlier. Anytime that we see Lord in capital letters in English Bibles, we know that it is intentionally replacing the tetragrammaton Yod-He-Vav-He, or as we often pronounce it, Yahweh. Anyone can look into any Hebrew concordance and see for themselves that Aaron literally dedicated the feast to Yahweh, the God that took them out of Egypt. This proves without a doubt that the Israelites were simply trying to replace Moses and connect to Yahweh in a different way. The Israelites were not trying to make God, so to speak, but God, Elohim. They chose a calf for Yahweh because he is Elohim. This is what is important to understand, because this is what they did. They chose to invent their own feast, their own holiday, to Yahweh instead of the feast outlined in Leviticus 23. They chose to worship God their own way instead of God's way. They sincerely thought that they were doing the right thing. They thought it was okay to make up their own holiday for Yahweh and worship him how they chose. But clearly, despite the fact that the Israelites were sincerely attempting to worship God, even dedicating the day to him, giving gifts to him, God did not see it that way. They were worshiping God through the pagan practice of using things to worship God and declaring and putting into effect a false holiday. They even made offerings to Yahweh. They really thought that Yahweh would accept their worship, just like Cain did, the way of Cain. And here's the main issue of the problem at hand. Because the Israelites decided to do things their own way instead of God's way, they made themselves out to be their own gods. Though they fully and sincerely wanted to follow Yahweh, they followed themselves and their own heart instead. This is exactly what we do with Christmas and Easter. We take the ways of man, ways of false gods, and then offer them all up to God and expect him to smile while we please ourselves in the process. Now we realize that might sound harsh, and many will not want to hear that. But no, it is the truth. When we do these things our way instead of his way, then who in our mind is God at that point? Do you see the problem from God's perspective? We can still be claiming to be worshiping the one true God, but if we abandon his way and do it our own way, we are actually worshiping false gods in the process. Sadly, we are worshiping ourselves, bowing down to ourselves, and following ourselves. We're following our own instructions instead of his. How does he want us to worship him? John chapter 4. But the hour is coming, and now is here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. How does he not want us to worship him? Deuteronomy 12:4. You must not worship Yahweh your God in their way. What way should we not learn? Learn not the ways of the nations. Jeremiah chapter 10. We fully realize that much of what we covered was shocking in the least. In reality, so far, this was mostly just an introduction to the topic. At this point, a couple of things should be clear. Yahweh said we cannot worship him in the ways that pagans worship their sun gods. That fully eliminates Christmas and Easter altogether, and that alone. In addition, clearly, Christmas and Easter are not rooted in truth. They come from false ways of worshiping false gods. These are the ways of the nations, ways he has told us not to learn. It might be surprising to many, but God is not on the same page of the let's keep Christ in Christmas bandwagon. God does not appreciate the Cain mentality, the mentality that says it's okay in one's heart to worship God in the way we choose, contrary to the way that he requests. We must learn from the mistakes of Israel, who, doing what was right in their own mind, chose to worship God in their own way, offering him a new holiday, a new festival with gifts and worship up to him. Cain was also sincere. Israelites with the golden calf were sincere. Our intent in celebrating Christmas and Easter may be very sincere as well. But the problem is this: according to God, not according to us, not according to anyone else. Despite all the theologians promising you it's simply okay, God himself said, no, it is not okay. It is not how I want to be worshipped. He loved us so much that he sent his own son that we might live. That being said, let's live for him in his ways, not our way. Let's love him back in the way that he has told us he wants to be loved. We hope that this has given you much already to consider. However, there is simply so much more. The question still remains, how did all these pagan, cultic sun god traditions become married to the Christian faith? Where did all this come from? How did it get here? And what do all these traditions originally mean? You'll be shocked to learn that many of these pagan sun god traditions and their original symbolism and where they came from. In the next part of this teaching, we will cover all these things and much more. You'll find that it starts to become even more interesting. We hope that this teaching has blessed you. And remember, continue to test everything. Shalom.